The Galactic Military Academy's training hall fell silent as Clara stepped onto the sparring mat. Around her, cadets from a dozen different species whispered among themselves, their translator devices buzzing with barely concealed mockery. Humans were still a novelty in the galaxy, fragile creatures from a death world who had somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel only 3 decades prior. Another human? Hissed Cathral, a 7-foot Vraxian warrior whose exoskeleton gleamed under the harsh lighting. His mandibles clicked with amusement. "They break so easily," Clara said nothing. She simply rolled her shoulders and drew her training blade, a simple, curved knife that looked almost primitive compared to the energy weapons favored by other species. Her instructor, Commander Zeph of the Antarian Coalition, regarded her with 4 skeptical eyes. "Cadet Clara," Zeph's translator rendered his clicking language into flat, emotionless words. "You understand this is full-contact combat training? We cannot adjust the difficulty for your species' limitations." "I understand, sir," Clara replied, her voice steady. George watched from the observation deck, his hands gripping the railing. He'd tried to warn her, tried to convince her to request the lighter training modules designed for fragile species. But Clara was stubborn. She'd been stubborn since the day they'd met at Earth's recruitment center. 2 kids from the slums of Neo-Chicago who'd seen the stars as their only way out. "She's going to get hurt," muttered another human cadet beside him. "Cathral hospitalized 3 recruits last month." George didn't answer. He'd seen Clara fight before, really fight, back in the alleys where they'd grown up. But that was against humans. Cathral was a different matter entirely. The Vraxian stepped onto the mat, cracking his neck with a sound like splitting timber. "Try not to die too quickly, human. I enjoy a good warm-up." Clara shifted her stance, blade held low, almost hidden behind her body. George recognized it immediately. The street-fighting posture she'd perfected in 1,000 desperate encounters. But there was something else now. Something refined and terrifyingly precise. The match began. Cathral lunged with the speed of a predator, his clawed hands reaching for Clara's throat. She wasn't there. In a movement so fluid it seemed almost lazy, she slipped past his guard, her blade tracing a line across his arm joint, the one weak point in Vraxian anatomy that even their instructors rarely mentioned. Cathral roared, more in surprise than pain. His arm went partially numb. "Lucky strike," he growled, circling more cautiously now. Clara said nothing. She never did during a fight. George had once asked her why, and she'd simply said, "Talking wastes breath. Breath is life." The Vraxian attacked again, this time with calculated strikes designed to overwhelm through sheer power. Clara flowed between them like water, her knife dancing in patterns that seemed random until they suddenly weren't. 3 more strikes, each one finding a nerve cluster, a joint, a pressure point that shouldn't have been obvious to a human who'd been in space for less than a year. Commander Zeph leaned forward, his translator silent. Around the room, the whispers had stopped. Cathral was breathing heavily now, 2 of his forearms hanging useless. What is this technique?" Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "Survival," she moved. Not with the wild desperation of someone fighting for their life, but with the cold mechanical precision of someone who had fought for their life so many times that it had become muscle memory. Her blade found Cathral's 3rd arm, then his leg, then, in a move that made half the observers gasp, she somehow maneuvered behind him and pressed the training blade against the weak point where his exoskeleton met his spine. "Yield," she said simply. Cathral collapsed to one knee, his pride shattered along with his combat effectiveness. "I yield," the training hall erupted. Commander Zeph was already accessing his datapad, his appendages moving frantically. George saw the commander's expression change from skepticism to alarm to something that looked almost like fear. "Cadet Clara, where did you learn this fighting style?" Zeph's voice had lost its condescending tone. Clara sheathed her blade. "The streets of Neo-Chicago, sir. Sector 7. George knew what that meant. Sector 7, where gang warfare had made the police give up, where children learned to fight before they learned to read, where a knife was cheaper than food and infinitely more useful." Zeph's datapad beeped urgently. "Commander!" His assistant's voice crackled through. "I've identified the technique patterns. Sir, she's using a hybrid style that matches 12 different band combat systems. The Thoraxian death dance, Vraxian nerve hunting. even elements of the Krellian Assassin's Code. How does a human cadet? She didn't learn them. George called out from the observation deck, unable to stay silent any longer. She invented them. We both did. When you grow up in a place where you fight every day just to survive, you learn what works. You take whatever keeps you alive. Clara looked up at him, a slight smile crossing her face. It was the first emotion she'd shown since entering the ring. Commander Zeph was quiet for a long moment. Then he addressed the entire training hall. Do you all understand what you just witnessed? This human, this fragile cadet, has independently developed combat techniques that took other species millennia to perfect. Techniques so effective, so brutal, that they've been banned by the Galactic Convention on Warfare. Cathral struggled to his feet, his pride demanding he stand. How? We are stronger, faster. But you've never been weak, Clara interrupted quietly. You've never had to be clever because you couldn't be strong. You've never had to memorize every vulnerability in every species because one mistake meant death. She paused. Humans come from a death world. But we didn't just survive our planet. We survived each other. George descended from the observation deck as the other cadets parted to let him through. He stood beside Clara, and together they faced the assembly of alien warriors who would never underestimate a human again. Commander Zeph made a note on his datapad. Cadet Clara, Cadet George, you will report to advanced combat training immediately. The galaxy needs to understand what humanity brings to the coalition. Not just our spirit, not just our determination, but our capacity to adapt, to learn, to turn weakness into weapon. As they left the training hall, Clara finally allowed herself to relax. Think they'll stop calling us fragile now? George laughed. Maybe, but I think we just made ourselves a lot of enemies too. Good, Clara replied, her hand resting on her blade. I prefer my enemies afraid. Behind them, the Galactic Military Academy began to understand a truth that would echo across the stars. Humanity had been forged in fire, tempered by hardship and sharpened by necessity. They were fragile only in comparison, but in the ways that mattered. In the darkness where survival was an art form, humans were terrifying. And Clara was just the beginning.